You don't deserve to wear something that expensive. Celeste Rowan grabbed the waitress's elegant evening dress with both hands and ripped the fabric apart before anyone could react. Gasps echoed across the ballroom as expensive silk tore from shoulder to waist. Several guests instinctively lifted their phones, while others laughed behind polite smiles. Hazel quietly held the torn dress together without saying a word. Then a cold voice cut through the silence. Take one more step toward my wife, and you'll regret it for the rest of your life. The ballroom remained frozen. Not because someone had shouted, not because security had intervened, but because every influential guest recognized the man who had just spoken. Dante Vescari walked forward with measured, unhurried steps. His tailored black tuxedo looked immaculate, despite the growing tension around him. He neither glared nor rushed. His calmness unsettled the room far more than anger ever could. Hazel lowered her eyes as she struggled to keep the torn fabric together. Before she could say a single word, Dante slipped off his dinner jacket and gently draped it across her shoulders. The expensive wool settled around her like a shield, hiding every tear Celeste had left behind. His fingertips briefly brushed Hazel's arm. "Are you hurt?" he asked softly. Hazel looked into his eyes and offered the smallest smile. "I'm all right." He nodded once. Only after making certain she was comfortable did he slowly turn towards Celeste Rowan. There was no rage in his expression. Only complete control. The silence stretched across the ballroom until it became almost unbearable. Finally, Dante spoke. "Who gave you permission to touch my wife?" His voice was quiet. Nobody answered. Not because they hadn't heard him, because every person in the room understood exactly what those words meant. My wife. The phrase echoed through the ballroom more powerfully than any announcement could have. A champagne glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the marble floor. Several guests instinctively lowered their phones. Others stared at Hazel with expressions that shifted from amusement to disbelief. The woman they had mistaken for an ordinary waitress had just been claimed as the wife of Dante Vescari. Across the room, Gavin Sterling felt the blood drain from his face. He had invited Dante as the guest of honor for the Foundation's annual charity gala. Winning the chairman's goodwill could secure investment for several billion-dollar developments. Everything tonight had been designed to impress him. Instead, his own girlfriend had publicly assaulted Dante's wife. Gavin forced a smile that looked painfully unnatural. "There must be some misunderstanding," he said carefully. "I'm sure Celeste never intended." Dante raised one finger. Gavin immediately fell silent. The gesture contained no aggression. Yet it carried the effortless authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Dante's attention returned to Celeste. She still stood in the center of the ballroom, though the confidence that had filled her moments earlier had vanished. Her hands trembled almost imperceptibly. "You," she whispered, "you're really his wife?" Hazel answered before Dante could. "Yes, nothing more. No dramatic speech. No accusation. Only one simple word spoken with quiet dignity." Ironically, that calm confirmation unsettled the audience even more than outrage would have. The room suddenly replayed the last few minutes in collective memory. The mocking laughter, the cruel comments about Hazel's body, the ripping sound of expensive fabric. Every witness realized they had stood by while an innocent woman was humiliated. No one wanted to meet Dante's eyes. Near the entrance, members of the Foundation's organizing committee exchanged anxious glances. Even the musicians had stopped playing, their instruments hanging motionless in their hands. For the first time since the gala had begun, Gavin understood something no amount of wealth or influence could change. The evening no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the quiet woman everyone had underestimated, and to the husband who had never needed to raise his voice to command an entire ballroom. For several long seconds, no one moved. The grand ballroom, which had buzzed with polished conversations and carefully rehearsed laughter only moments before, had become unnaturally quiet. Every guest seemed reluctant to breathe too loudly, as though even the slightest sound might draw Dante Vescari's attention. Then an elderly gentleman near the front frowned. He leaned toward the woman beside him and whispered, "Wait, I know her." His companion looked puzzled. "The designer?" "No, not the designer." He studied Hazel more carefully, before his eyes widened. "The volunteer." His words spread through the nearby guests like the first ripple across still water. "The volunteer?" Another businessman blinked in disbelief. "No, that can't be right." "It is," replied a woman who had attended nearly every Vescari Foundation charity gala over the past decade. "She's been here every year." Someone from the foundation's event committee nodded immediately. 3 consecutive years, another organizer quietly added. She always requested the same assignment. Guest hospitality. A wave of confusion swept through the ballroom. Hazel Mercer, the internationally respected hospitality interior designer whose projects had transformed some of the country's most luxurious hotels, had voluntarily spent 3 years greeting guests, serving refreshments, arranging seating cards, and helping elderly donors find their tables. Without telling anyone who she was, without introducing herself, without asking for recognition, one billionaire suddenly laughed, not out of mockery this time, but complete embarrassment. "Oh my goodness!" Several guests turned toward him. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Last year," he paused before groaning, "I asked her if the chocolate soufflé could be a little warmer." A few people chuckled despite the tension. Another investor raised his hand sheepishly. "I asked her where the restroom was. I remember apologizing because I thought she looked too elegant to be working the floor," a retired ambassador admitted. "And she smiled," someone else added. "She walked my wife all the way across the ballroom because her heels were hurting." The memories kept surfacing, one after another. Each story made Hazel appear even more extraordinary. A hotel owner laughed at himself. "I spent 20 minutes explaining hospitality management to her." His friend stared. "You gave hospitality advice to one of the country's best hospitality designers?" The man buried his face in one hand. "I'd appreciate it if nobody repeated that story." Even Dante allowed himself the faintest smile. The atmosphere shifted ever so slightly. Not away from the humiliation Hazel had endured, but toward the growing realization that genuine kindness often passed unnoticed simply because it wore no title. A member of the foundation staff stepped forward. "I can confirm everything." She looked directly at Gavin before continuing. Mrs. Mercer always refused VIP treatment. She insisted on wearing the standard volunteer badge. She even stayed after midnight helping us stack chairs when everyone else had gone home. Several organizers nodded immediately. And every year, she declined media interviews. She never allowed photographers to identify her. Most of us didn't even know she was married. A reporter lowered his camera. "So, all this time, no one knew?" The staff member smiled softly. She wanted it that way. Across the room, Gavin felt his carefully crafted image of the evening collapsing piece by piece. The gala had been marketed as a celebration of generosity. Yet the audience now realized the person who had quietly embodied that ideal for 3 years had been mistaken for someone unimportant simply because she was serving drinks instead of standing on the stage. Celeste shifted uneasily. She had built her reputation on appearances, luxury labels, perfect photographs, exclusive guest lists. Yet the woman she had dismissed as ordinary had earned the admiration of the foundation without ever asking for applause. For the first time that evening, Celeste found herself surrounded not by supporters, but by disappointed faces. Hazel, meanwhile, remained exactly as she had always been. She thanked a nervous volunteer who handed her a glass of water. She smiled at the elderly donor whose hands were trembling. She even reassured a young waitress who looked terrified that she might lose her job because of the commotion. Watching her, more than one guest realized an uncomfortable truth. Status could command attention. Money could purchase influence. Power could silence a room. But character revealed itself only when no one believed you were important. As whispers continued to ripple through the ballroom, Dante gently guided Hazel to a quieter corner near the grand staircase. The orchestra remained silent, the musicians waiting for someone to decide whether the evening could continue. Hazel adjusted the jacket resting on her shoulders. "I didn't expect tonight to end like this," she said quietly. Dante looked at her torn gown before meeting her eyes. "Neither did I." His voice carried neither anger nor pity, only concern. The sight stirred a memory that had first made him fall in love with her years earlier, long before their secret marriage, before international awards, before billion-dollar projects. Hazel Mercer had been a young designer, struggling to establish her reputation. Her parents had never been wealthy. Her father restored historic buildings. Her mother volunteered at community shelters, teaching families how thoughtful spaces could bring dignity even during difficult times. From childhood, Hazel heard the same lesson repeated countless times. If kindness depends on who is watching, it isn't kindness. Her mother often added another. The easiest people to respect are the powerful. The people who reveal your character are those who have nothing to offer you. Those words quietly shaped Hazel's entire life. When her career finally flourished, reporters often asked why she rarely attended glamorous industry parties. She always answered with the same gentle smile. "I prefer meeting the people who actually use the spaces I design." Luxury hotels hired her because she understood elegance. Guests loved her work because she understood comfort. She believed beautiful rooms were never created merely to impress wealthy visitors. They were created to make every person entering them feel welcomed. That philosophy earned her awards, but it also kept her grounded. Then Dante entered her life. They met during the renovation of one of Vescari International's historic hotels. Unlike everyone else, Hazel had no idea who he truly was. She knew only that he represented the investment company funding the restoration. She treated him exactly as she treated every client. When Dante suggested increasing the project's budget to create a more extravagant lobby, Hazel politely disagreed. "The guests won't remember another crystal chandelier," she had explained. "They'll remember whether an elderly couple can comfortably reach the reception desk." Dante had blinked. No consultant had ever challenged him so calmly. Instead of discussing prestige, she discussed people. Instead of luxury, she discussed kindness. That afternoon lasted nearly 4 hours. By the end of the meeting, Dante realized he had spent more time listening than speaking. It was an unfamiliar experience. One he unexpectedly enjoyed. Months later, when he finally confessed his feelings, Hazel asked him only one question. "If nobody knew your name, who would you be?" He had thought about that question for days. When he answered honestly, she smiled. That smile became the beginning of everything. After their wedding, Dante quietly offered to announce their marriage publicly. It would have made Hazel one of the most recognized women in the country overnight. Magazine covers, exclusive interviews, luxury endorsements. Every opportunity imaginable. Hazel declined every one of them. "I already have a name." She reached across the dinner table that evening and squeezed his hand. "I don't want people opening doors because I'm your wife. I want them opening doors because I earned the key myself." Dante had never admired anyone more. He knew countless people who chased influence. Very few walked away from it willingly. So they made a promise together. Their marriage would remain private. Hazel would keep her own surname. She would build her career without using the Vescari name, and every achievement would belong entirely to her. 3 years later, standing in the middle of a silent ballroom while wearing his jacket over a torn dress, Hazel had no regrets about that decision, not because the secret had protected her, but because it had revealed everyone else. Without knowing who she was, people had shown her exactly how they measured another human being. And that truth, though painful, was more valuable than any title money could buy. The silence lingering over the ballroom was finally broken by Celeste Rowan. She forced a nervous laugh that fooled no one. "This has all become a terrible misunderstanding," she said, smoothing the front of her designer gown, as though composure alone could erase what had happened. "The dress tore because I reached out to stop her. It was an accident." Not a single guest responded. Even Gavin hesitated. He wanted desperately to support her version of events, yet he had watched enough to know how fragile that explanation sounded. Celeste noticed the uncertainty spreading across the room. She straightened her shoulders. "Everyone is acting as though I attacked someone. I merely touched the fabric. Expensive dresses sometimes tear." A murmur swept through the audience. Someone quietly whispered, "That's not what I saw." Another guest nodded. "I heard what she said before she grabbed Hazel." Gavin stepped forward with a practiced corporate smile. "Perhaps we should avoid embarrassing anyone further. Tonight is about charity." His words were polished, diplomatic, designed to redirect attention. Before anyone could respond, the Foundation's director spoke from the control table. "I'm afraid that's no longer possible." Every head turned. The elderly director looked deeply troubled. "Our ballroom security system records every public area." He glanced toward Dante. "Chairman Vescari, with your permission." Dante simply inclined his head. The lights dimmed. A large projection screen descended behind the stage. Within seconds, the security recording appeared. There was no dramatic music, no edited footage, only the quiet truth captured by a ceiling camera. Guests watched Hazel carrying a tray of champagne with her usual calm grace. They saw Celeste notice her. Pause. Look Hazel up and down with open disdain. Then came the audio. "You don't deserve to wear something that expensive." The words echoed through the silent ballroom. Several guests lowered their eyes. The recording continued. Celeste stepped closer. She smirked, then deliberately gripped both sides of Hazel's evening gown. There was no attempt to steady her, no accidental stumble, no misunderstanding. She pulled hard. The elegant fabric split apart from shoulder to waist, exactly as everyone had remembered. Laughter followed, not from Hazel, from a handful of guests who now looked deeply ashamed. Then the recording captured something even more painful. Hazel never raised her voice, never pushed back. She simply gathered the torn fabric together and quietly tried to preserve her dignity while dozens of strangers watched. The screen went black. Silence returned. But it was no longer uncertain. It was heavy. Final. Irrefutable. Celeste's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No explanation came. There wasn't one. A woman seated near the front slowly stood. She was the chairperson of one of the city's largest charitable foundations. "I have spent 20 years asking people to donate with compassion." She looked directly at Celeste. "And tonight you reminded us that generosity without kindness is only another performance." One by one, other guests nodded. An internationally known fashion editor sighed. "I admired your taste." She shook her head sadly. "I mistook elegance for character." The words struck harder than any insult. Celeste had spent years building an image of flawless sophistication. That image was now collapsing under the weight of her own behavior. Meanwhile, Gavin felt the disaster slipping completely beyond his control. Every major investor in the room was watching. Journalists had stopped taking glamorous photographs and were instead documenting uncomfortable expressions. The gala that was supposed to elevate his company's reputation was becoming an unforgettable lesson in public accountability. He stepped toward Dante. "I sincerely apologize for what happened. I assure you, this doesn't reflect our organization's values." Dante regarded him calmly. "It reflects the values that were tolerated." The sentence contained no anger, only truth. Gavin lowered his head, because he knew Dante was right. He had overlooked Celeste's cruelty for years whenever it benefited the company's public image. Tonight, that choice had finally come due. Across the ballroom, Hazel remained astonishingly composed. She accepted a replacement shawl from another volunteer. She quietly thanked the Foundation staff for their kindness. She neither demanded justice nor celebrated Celeste's humiliation. Watching her, many guests realized something profound. The woman whose dignity had been torn apart only minutes earlier still possessed more grace than the people who had judged her. No one applauded. No one spoke. The enormous ballroom seemed suspended between embarrassment and expectation, every guest wondering what Dante Vascari would do next. Most of them expected power, some expected punishment. A few even anticipated the cold efficiency for which the Vascari name was quietly feared throughout the city. Instead, Dante reached for the microphone resting on the podium. He neither looked at Celeste nor Gavin. His attention remained on Hazel. For a brief moment, he simply admired the woman standing beside him. Despite the torn gown, despite hundreds of eyes fixed upon her. She continued, thanking volunteers who nervously offered assistance. She still smiled whenever an elderly donor approached. She had not changed, not even after being humiliated in front of the city's most influential people. Dante finally began to speak. "Many of you believe tonight became memorable because of what happened a few minutes ago." He paused. "I disagree." The room listened in complete silence. "What happened tonight merely revealed something that has existed for years." His gaze swept slowly across the audience. "You admired this foundation's charity galas. You praised the warmth, the elegance, the hospitality, the feeling that every guest, regardless of wealth or influence, was genuinely welcome." Several long-time donors nodded unconsciously. Those details had always distinguished the Vascari Foundation from every other charity event in the city. Dante smiled softly. Very few people ever asked who created that feeling. He turned toward Hazel. "My wife did." A ripple of surprise moved through guests who had assumed Hazel merely volunteered at the events. Dante continued. "For the past 3 years, Hazel has quietly designed the guest experience behind every major foundation gala. She redesigned traffic flow so elderly donors never had to stand in long lines. She reorganized seating so first-time guests would never feel isolated. She worked with chefs to ensure guests with allergies received the same elegant service as everyone else." He looked around the ballroom. She personally trained volunteers to greet every visitor with the same respect, whether they donated $10 or 10 million. Several members of the organizing committee wiped away tears. Everything he said was true. Yet Hazel had insisted they never mention her contribution publicly. Dante continued. "Many luxury designers compete to create beautiful rooms. My wife designs how people feel inside those rooms." The sentence settled gently over the audience. Its simplicity carried more weight than any business achievement. The foundation director stepped onto the stage. "I would like to add something." Dante nodded respectfully and stepped aside. The elderly man faced the guests. 3 years ago, Mrs. Mercer gave us one instruction. He unfolded a small notebook he always carried. I wrote it down because I believed it summarized everything charity should represent. He adjusted his glasses before reading aloud. If our guests remember the flowers, we decorated well. If they remember how people treated them, we succeeded. The ballroom became perfectly still. That single sentence explained every decision Hazel had made. Not for recognition, not for awards, simply because she believed dignity belonged to everyone. Dante looked toward the volunteers standing nervously along the walls. Raise your hands if Hazel ever introduced herself by her profession. Not a single hand moved. If she ever asked you to call her Mrs. Viscari. Again, nothing. The foundation director smiled. She introduced herself exactly the same way every year. My name is Hazel. I'm happy to help. That was all. A quiet laugh spread through the room. Not mocking, affectionate. More stories emerged. A volunteer remembered Hazel carrying heavy supply boxes because the younger staff looked exhausted. Another recalled discovering Hazel polishing glass centerpieces after midnight because she refused to leave unfinished work for the cleaning crew. An elderly donor spoke through tears. My late husband attended his final public event here. He was confused because of his illness. I never learned the young volunteer's name, but she stayed beside him until I returned. He looked toward Hazel. It was you. Hazel smiled gently. I'm glad he wasn't alone. The elderly man lowered his head, overcome with emotion. Many guests discreetly wiped away tears. Dante returned to the microphone one final time. There is one last truth I want everyone to remember. He rested a gentle hand against Hazel's shoulder. You admired tonight's event. Without realizing the woman you mocked helped create it. No one moved. Then someone near the back of the ballroom began clapping. Another joined. Then another. Within seconds, the applause spread across the entire room. People rose from their chairs one after another until every guest was standing. The ovation was long, sincere, unrehearsed. No one applauded because Hazel was married to Dante Viscari. They applauded because, for the first time, they finally understood the quiet woman whose kindness had shaped an entire evening without ever asking to be seen. Hazel looked at the crowd, her eyes glistening. She had spent years believing that the best work happened behind the scenes. Tonight, the spotlight had found her anyway. Not because she had sought attention, but because genuine character could remain hidden only for so long. The gala eventually resumed. Not with the effortless glamour everyone had expected when they arrived, but with a quieter atmosphere, one filled with reflection. The orchestra began playing again, though the music seemed softer now, almost respectful. Conversations returned in gentle murmurs instead of loud laughter, and guests who had once hurried toward the city's most influential figures now found themselves approaching Hazel instead. One by one. Without cameras, without reporters, without seeking attention. An elderly woman who had donated to the foundation for nearly 20 years stopped in front of Hazel. I owe you an apology. Hazel smiled kindly. You don't owe me anything. I do. The woman lowered her eyes. I watched what happened. I should have spoken sooner. Hazel reached out and gently held her hands. You spoke now. Sometimes courage simply arrives later. The woman's eyes filled with tears. Thank you for giving me that kindness. Nearby, several volunteers gathered around Hazel. Some looked guilty, others embarrassed. A young waitress nervously approached with a neatly wrapped package. We found another evening dress in the wardrobe. I know it isn't as beautiful as yours, but we hoped you'd accept it. Hazel looked at the shy young woman and smiled. I'd be honored. Instead of disappearing into a private suite reserved for VIP guests, she changed in the same volunteer dressing room she had used every year. The room was small, crowded, filled with garment racks, coffee cups, sewing kits, and exhausted staff members, exactly where she felt comfortable. When she stepped back into the ballroom, Wearing the simple replacement gown, applause quietly broke out again. Not because the dress was expensive. It wasn't. But because everyone understood that Hazel herself had always been the evening's greatest elegance. Hours later, after the final guests had departed, the ballroom looked entirely different. Fresh flowers were being collected. Candles were extinguished one by one. Volunteers folded tablecloths while the cleaning crew prepared to work through the night. Despite everything that had happened, Hazel rolled up the sleeves of Dante's jacket and began stacking decorative menus. Dante watched from a short distance before walking over. "You know," he said with an amused smile, "I'm fairly certain no one would complain if the chairwoman's wife skipped cleanup tonight." Hazel laughed softly. "I'm not the chairwoman's wife. I'm yours. And neither title excuses me from helping." He shook his head with quiet admiration. "You've just received a standing ovation from the most influential people in the city." She lifted another stack of menus. "They still need to be packed." A volunteer passing nearby smiled to herself. Some people inspired others without ever realizing it. Later that night, the city lights shimmered beneath the windows of the Vescari penthouse. For the first time all evening, silence belonged only to the two of them. Hazel stood on the balcony, wrapped in a light blanket, while Dante handed her a warm cup of tea. Neither spoke immediately. The events of the evening still lingered between them. Finally, Hazel broke the silence. "Do you ever wonder if we made the wrong choice?" Dante looked at her. "About what?" "Keeping our marriage secret." She traced a finger around the rim of the cup. "If people had known, perhaps tonight never would have happened." Dante leaned beside her, gazing at the sleeping city below. "You're right." She looked at him, surprised by the answer. He smiled gently. "It wouldn't have happened." A brief pause followed. "But then, we would never have learned the truth." Hazel remained quiet. Dante continued. "Tonight answered the question we've carried for 3 years." "What question?" He turned toward her completely. "Whether people respected you, or simply respected the Vescari name." His voice remained calm. "They showed us exactly who they were." "Before they discovered who you were," Hazel thought back to the evening, to the laughter, the whispers, the volunteers, the donors, the apologies, the standing ovation. Everything had changed, only after the truth became known. Yet something else had remained unchanged. Her own choices. She had still greeted every guest warmly, still comforted frightened volunteers, still thanked the people helping her. No title had changed her, and no humiliation had broken her. "I kept wondering whether hiding was worth it," she admitted. Dante reached for her hand. "You were never hiding. You were simply living honestly." He squeezed her fingers gently. "And honesty has a remarkable habit. It lasts longer than admiration." Hazel rested her head against his shoulder. For the first time since the dress had been torn apart, the ache in her heart finally eased. Not because everyone now knew she was married to one of the city's most powerful men, but because she realized something much more valuable. Respect that depended upon a famous surname could disappear as quickly as applause. Respect, earned through years of quiet kindness, could survive any misunderstanding. The torn dress would eventually be forgotten. The headlines would fade. The gossip would move on. But the way people remembered being treated, that endured. And that had always been the kind of legacy Hazel Mercer wanted to leave behind. 6 months later, spring sunlight streamed through the glass walls of the National Center for Arts and Culture, where architects, designers, philanthropists, and journalists from across the country had gathered for one of the industry's most prestigious ceremonies. The National Humanitarian Design Awards celebrated professionals whose work had improved lives beyond aesthetics. For the first time in years, Hazel Mercer accepted an invitation to stand in the spotlight. This time, she made no effort to arrive unnoticed. As the doors opened, she entered beside Dante Vascari. There were no whispered speculations, no hidden identities, no secret introductions. Everyone already knew they were husband and wife. Yet something had changed. And when the master of ceremonies welcomed them, he did not announce her as Mrs. Dante Vascari. He smiled warmly and said, "Please welcome award-winning hospitality designer, Hazel Mercer." The audience applauded immediately. The recognition belonged to her, not to the man beside her. A short film began playing across the large theater screen. Instead of showcasing luxury hotels or glamorous ballrooms, it highlighted ordinary moments created through Hazel's designs. An elderly veteran comfortably navigating an accessible hotel lobby. A child with sensory sensitivities smiling inside a thoughtfully designed waiting area. Volunteers serving meals in beautifully organized charity halls where every guest felt respected. The narrator concluded with a simple sentence: "Great design is not measured by how impressive a room appears, but by how deeply the people inside it feel they belong." When Hazel's name was announced as the recipient of the National Humanitarian Design Award, the audience rose together in a standing ovation. She accepted the Crystal Award with quiet grace. Her acceptance speech remained brief. She thanked her parents for teaching her that kindness should never depend upon status. She thanked every volunteer who believed small acts of care could change an entire evening. Finally, she looked toward Dante. "Thank you for protecting me without ever trying to change who I wanted to become." He smiled, his pride unmistakable. After the ceremony, reporters gathered around the couple. One journalist asked the question everyone seemed eager to hear. "Chairman Vascari, out of all the remarkable women you could have met, what made you fall in love with Hazel?" The room became silent. Dante looked at his wife before answering. "When we first met, she had no idea who I really was." A few reporters smiled. He continued, "She wasn't impressed by my company. She wasn't interested in my influence. She never asked about my wealth." He reached for Hazel's hand. She cared about people nobody else noticed. That told me everything I needed to know. Cameras flashed across the room. Hazel gently squeezed his hand. Not out of nervousness. Out of gratitude. Years earlier, she had feared that standing beside one of the city's most powerful men might one day erase her own identity. Instead, their marriage had become a place where both of them could remain completely themselves. As they walked toward the exit, the audience applauded once more. This time, they were not applauding the chairman of an international empire. They were not applauding the feared man whose influence could silence an entire ballroom. They were applauding Hazel Mercer, a woman who had never needed power to prove her worth, a wife whose quiet strength had inspired respect long before anyone knew her name. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.